have an option to override either the send or the send async method and then implement your custom behavior. And what I'm doing inside of the send async method override is obtaining an authorization token from Keycloak using the client credentials flow. We're going to examine this method in just a moment, but once I obtain the authorization token, I'm going to set its value as the authorization header on the request. And this request is going to be what we are sending from the identity provider service right here using our typed HTTP client. The next step is just sending the request using the base method call of send async. We ensure that we get back a success status code, and if that is the case, we can return the HTTP response message, which is going to give us back the identity ID eventually. Now, what's going on inside of the get authorization token method? If we take a look at the implementation, you can see that I'm setting up some key value pairs for my authentication request parameters, and I'm specifying the client ID, the client secret, the scope, and the grant type as client credentials. I also demonstrated this authentication flow from Postman in the lesson about setting up Keycloak. Then we are using these parameters to turn them into a form URL encoded content. Then I can create my HTTP request message. We're going to send a post request, so I'm specifying HTTP method post, and the endpoint where we are sending this request is the token URL. Finally, I'm setting the request content instance as the content of my request, and sending this using the base send async method. We get back an HTTP response message. I'm making sure that this is a success status code. And finally, I'm trying to parse an authentication token from the response content. The only value that I care about is the actual access token that we are going to use and set it as the authorization header value to authenticate with the admin API. And now that we have our implementation in place, let's wire up some dependency injection and configure our services. I'm going to start with our Keycloak options by saying configure, specifying the Keycloak options type, and then we're going to get the section called users Keycloak. Notice that I'm referencing to the users section, which is going to be inside of the configuration file for the users module. So I'm scoping that configuration to the users module because that is the only place where it's relevant, and then Keycloak will be the section name containing the concrete values. The next thing I'm going to configure is a transient service for my delegating handler. And I want to make a remark here that the recommended service lifetime for delegating handlers is transient. The next thing I'm going to do is to configure my strongly typed HTTP client. So I will say services, add HTTP client, and then I can specify the Keycloak client. I'm going to use an override that accepts a service provider and the HTTP client instance. And we're going to use this delegate to configure my HTTP client. I'm going to resolve a Keycloak options instance by using the service provider. I'm going to say get required service of iOptions of Keycloak options, and then I'm just going to access the value that we get back. And what I want to do is set the base address of my HTTP client, and remember that this is the Keycloak client, which is the one calling the endpoint to create a new user. We're going to set a value to the URI, and the value will come from our Keycloak options type, and we are going to point it to the admin URL. Then I'm going to add my delegating handler by saying add HTTP message handler, and I will specify the Keycloak authentication delegating handler type. And finally, I'm going to register my identity provider service as another transient service. So let's say identity provider, and I will specify the identity provider service as the implementation. Let's go ahead and set up the configuration values in our application settings. So I will head over into the API project and look for the modules users JSON file. Inside of this, I'm going to add a Keycloak section that's going to contain the admin URL, the token URL, the confidential client ID, the client secret, and the public client ID. Inside of the module users development JSON, I'm going to add the actual values that we will use in development, and this will point to the Evently realm internally in the Docker network, as well as to the token endpoint used for the client credentials flow. This is my confidential client name and client secret, and you can grab both of these values from the Keycloak dashboard. And I'm also adding the public client ID, which is Evently public client. As usual, you can grab these values from the code snippet that will be under the video. At this point, we should be ready to test out our registration flow using Keycloak. So let's start the application and see if everything is working as expected. I will send a post request to the user's register endpoint with some valid information. So if I hit send, we will hit the breakpoint in the registered user command handler. So let's step into the identity provider service and let's slowly walk through the code step by step. After creating the user representation model, we will use our typed client to send a post request to the user's endpoint. I'm going to hit continue and we will land on a breakpoint that I placed in the Keycloak authentication delegating handler. This is going to send an authentication request to obtain an access token using the client credentials flow. And you can see that we get back an authorization token instance containing the actual access token value. Down below, you can see parts of the log for the post request that we sent to the token endpoint. We're going to set the access token value as the authorization header and send the actual request to register a user. So I'm going to say continue, and you can see that we land back in the Keycloak client. And if we check the response status code, it's 201 created. Now I'm going to step into the method that's going to extract the identity ID of the user. And if we take a look at the location header, you can see that it's pointing to the internal instance of Evently identity. The port is 8080, which is the internal Keycloak port. And then finally, it's pointing to the user's resource with a specified ID at the end of the route. This is the actual value that I'm trying to parse. And you can see that we get back the identity ID. Let's return from this method into the identity provider service, which is going to complete successfully. And finally, we can create a user and insert the user into the database together with the identity ID value. So I'm going to hit continue and we will get back a response containing this user's identifier. Now this value is different from the identity ID assigned to the user in Keycloak. We can use this identifier to get the user's information. I'm going to send a GET request to this endpoint and it should return me the user's profile. If I send this request, you can see that we get back a 401 unauthorized because we only allow authenticated users to access this endpoint. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's use this email address and the password to obtain an access token for the user. I'm going to send a post request to the token endpoint and we will get back a valid access token. Now, when I specify this access token in the request, using the bearer token authorization token type and send the request again, you can see that we are authenticating with our newly registered user and we are able to get back the user's profile information. If I go over to the database for a moment, you can see the row in the users table containing the user that we have just registered, and this is our user's identifier, but you can also see the identity ID that was assigned to this user in Keycloak, and this is important so that we can connect these two instances together in the two different systems. And with this, we can slowly wrap up our implementation of user registration with Keycloak. Overall, the changes to our application layer and the use case were minimal comparing to where we started from. Most of the changes were made in the infrastructure project. The only abstraction we needed was an identity provider service that we use to call Keycloak, and this is an optimistic approach to registering a user with Keycloak instead of doing a check if the specified email is available and then attempting to register a user, because that approach is susceptible to race conditions. I think this is a more robust way to approach this, and the worst case scenario is we get back a 409 response from Keycloak and then we can gracefully fail inside of the handle method. Which brings us to the end of this lesson where we implemented user registration with Keycloak. In the next lesson, we will be implementing role-based access control for fine-grained authorization.